Okay, ready to dive in? Today we're tackling something a bit of a head scratcher, right? It's barebacking during the AIDS epidemic, which on the surface seems kind of counterintuitive.
Yeah,
You know, with HIV being a very real threat, you'd think folks would be, well, more cautious.
right.
But as we often find, especially when it comes to, well, sex, human behavior isn't always so straightforward, is it?
Nope, not at all.
So to get a clearer picture, we're going to be using some academic studies that really try to dig into the mindset of the gay community during those times,
Okay.
particularly how they communicated about risk and all that. By the end of this, you'll have a better grasp on, well, why people make the choices they do, even if those choices seem, a little illogical.
Sounds like a fascinating deep dive.
It is. It really makes you think.
It definitely forces us to look beyond simple risk versus reward, There were some pretty powerful psychological and social dynamics that played a huge role in all this.
Absolutely. So to untangle all of that,
Yeah.
our sources suggest we've got to rewind a bit, look at the historical context, set the stage.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for the longest time, Western society, well, it hasn't exactly had the most positive view of homosexuality, you know what I mean?
Right.
And that stigma, it created this huge barrier to open and honest conversations about sexual health within the gay community.
It was like just by being open about your sexuality, you were already putting yourself at risk in a way.
Exactly. And that tragically contributed to how fast HIV spread in the early days.
Yeah.
Like, if you can't even talk about something, how can you educate yourself, protect yourself and others?
Right. It's a really sad example of how societal attitudes can have these very real, very dangerous consequences.
Absolutely.
So, okay, we've got this backdrop of silence and stigma, but then AIDS emerges. Did that at least shift things a bit?
It did initially. At the beginning, when ads first appeared on the scene, there were some positive changes. Condom use went up. There was a bigger focus on safe sex practices. Okay.
But then, as the epidemic went on, a new trend popped up: barebacking.
And just so we're all clear, we're talking about intentional unprotected sex here.
Right, not just, accidents or slip-ups.
Exactly. One of our sources, a researcher named Julian, he put it pretty bluntly back in '97. He said, "Why do we continue to engage each other in anal sex without a condom?" And it's a question that researchers are, well, still wrestling with today.
Yeah, and the research actually rules out those simpler explanations you might think of, like ignorance about HIV or just, not thinking in the heat of the moment.
Right.
The studies we're looking at today, they suggest that for a lot of people, this was a conscious choice.
Which on the surface just seems baffling. So how do we even begin to make sense of that?
One theory that might shed some light is something called reactance theory.
Reactance theory.
It's this idea that when people feel like their freedom is being threatened, like someone's trying to control them, they tend to rebel.
Oh, so like the whole forbidden fruit kind of thing? Yeah, exactly. You tell a teenager they absolutely can't do something, boom, suddenly it's the most tempting thing in the world.
Makes sense.
So now think about that in the context we've been talking about, years of societal pressure, stigma, discrimination, all that.
Right.
That could easily lead to a very deep sense of powerlessness within the gay community.
So then choosing to engage in barebacking, even though it's risky, could be a way of taking back control. It's like saying, you're not going to dictate my choices, even if those choices are about my own health.
Yeah, that's one way to interpret it, like a rebellion against this idea of always having to be safe, especially when those messages about safety are coming from a society that historically has shunned them.
That's a good point.
But this rebellion thing, it goes deeper than just reacting to societal pressures.
Okay, how so?
Well, one of our sources, Donna Orange, she argues there's this broader societal belief at play here. She says that high-risk takers, they're seen as the ones who get the big rewards.
Oh.
And those who play it safe, they're viewed as, well, losers. So it's not just about pushing back against restrictions. It's also about buying into this image of the daring risk taker.
So you've got this historical context of oppression, which fuels this need to reclaim control. And on top of that, you have this cultural message saying that risk-taking is, well, kind of glamorous.
Exactly.
But there's another piece to this puzzle, right? This idea of intersubjective systems.
Right.
That sounds kind of complex.
It is, but it's key to understanding how group dynamics factor into individual behavior. Basically, intersubjective systems means we create meaning and understanding through our interactions with others.
Okay.
Our behaviors are heavily influenced by the shared beliefs and values of the groups we're a part of.
So if barebacking is seen as a way to rebel or to reclaim control within a specific social group,
Yeah.
that shared understanding can make it more appealing, even if it goes against, common sense.
Exactly. And it even shapes how people talk about sensitive topics like, death and risk. Donna Orange, she suggests that in the context of the AIDS epidemic, barebacking could be seen as a way of having a conversation about mortality and risk.
But is it really a conversation if it's rooted in risky behavior? It seems more like a dangerous gamble.
It might look that way from the outside, but from the intersubjective perspective, these actions, they're loaded with meaning. They're expressing feelings of, well, maybe powerlessness or despair, especially when facing a disease like AIDS.
So it's less about the physical act itself and more about what it symbolizes within that specific social context.
Right. It's a way of communicating something that's hard to put into words.
Mm.
And then Stephen Halpert, another researcher, he adds another layer to this. He connects societal hatred and prejudice to suicidal behavior,
Whoa.
suggesting a possible link to self-destructive tendencies within, well, marginalized groups.
That's pretty heavy. But it makes you wonder if, for some people, barebacking was a way of expressing this deep despair that went beyond even the fear of HIV.
Yeah, it's a tough question to face. But it highlights just how complex this issue really is. We're seeing how tightly interwoven societal attitudes, personal psychology, and communication are in this whole phenomenon.
So barebacking isn't just about individual risk assessment, it's about these larger forces at play.
Exactly.
Wow, okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, historical context, this urge to rebel, the power of social groups, and even this idea of risky behavior as a form of communication. But I'm guessing there's still more to unpack, right?
Oh, absolutely. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how the AIDS epidemic became not just a medical crisis, but a communication crisis as well. We'll look at how fear, misinformation, and stigma created a perfect storm for, well, for choices that had devastating consequences.
Can't wait to dig into that. This is fascinating stuff.
It is, isn't it?
You mentioned earlier that the AIDS epidemic was, in a way, also a communication crisis.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Well, think about it. All that stigma surrounding homosexuality and HIV, it made having open and honest conversations incredibly difficult.
Right.
Even about, basic sexual health. It was almost like there was this wall of silence built up around the whole issue.
And as we kind of saw in the first part of our deep dive, silence can breed fear and misinformation, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Especially when you're dealing with something as new and as scary as HIV was back then.
Exactly. When accurate information is hard to come by, people, well, they tend to fall back on those shared understandings within their social groups. It's like, okay, what do we think about this? How do we make sense of this? Which takes us back to that concept of intersubjective systems.
Right. That idea that how we understand the world is shaped by the people we surround ourselves with.
Exactly.
So in the context of AIDS, if the prevailing message within your group was, say, condoms aren't reliable or HIV isn't that big of a deal,
Yeah.
you might be less likely to question those beliefs, even if, deep down you had some doubts.
That's the real danger of misinformation within a close-knit community. It can create this false sense of security, or even a sense of fatalism. Like, well, if everyone's doing it, it can't be that bad, can it?
Right.
And that kind of thinking can lead to some really, really risky choices.
It's almost like peer pressure, but amplified. You know?
Yeah.
It's not just about fitting in with your immediate friends. It's about belonging to a larger community that's already facing so much discrimination, so much fear.
Exactly. And this brings us to another crucial aspect of communication, the actual language used when talking about these sensitive topics. During the AIDS epidemic, there was a lot of moralizing language around HIV and sexuality. People with AIDS were often labeled as promiscuous or irresponsible, further reinforcing the stigma and shame.
So instead of treating it like a public health crisis that required, well, compassion and understanding, it became a moral judgment. And if you frame it that way, it's no wonder people were hesitant to seek help or even to talk about it openly.
Right. That judgmental language created this atmosphere of fear and silence, which, as we've discussed, is incredibly counterproductive when you're trying to, encourage safe sex or get people tested.
It's like pushing the problem further underground, making it even harder to deal with.
Exactly. But even beyond the specific words used, there was the sense that certain messages were being amplified while others were being silenced.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, there were powerful groups, who had a vested interest in controlling the narrative around HIV/AIDS. Some political and religious groups, they saw the epidemic as an opportunity to push their own agendas, often at the expense of public health and accurate information.
So it wasn't just a lack of communication. It was about certain voices being given a platform while others were being actively suppressed.
Right. And in that environment, it's easy to see how misinformation and fear could really take root.
And when you combine that with all the historical context, that stigma and discrimination we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
like a recipe for disaster, isn't it? You've got people who are already feeling marginalized, isolated, distrustful of institutions, and then you layer on this lack of reliable information and a whole lot of fear-mongering.
Exactly. It's a stark reminder of just how crucial it is to have access to accurate, unbiased information.
Especially when it comes to something as sensitive and potentially life-threatening as a public health crisis.
Couldn't agree more.
But this deep dive, it's not just about reflecting on the past, right? There are some valuable lessons here we can apply to our lives today.
Absolutely. What we're really talking about here is the power of communication to shape our choices.
Okay.
Both for the better and, well, for the worse.
Right.
When we create environments where open and honest conversation is difficult or even dangerous, we're basically setting ourselves up for problems.
Yeah.
Whether it's related to sexual health, mental health, or any issue that carries that weight of stigma.
So, in a sense, we all have this responsibility to cultivate a communication climate that, well, encourages those healthy choices and discourages the harmful ones. But how do we actually do that? Seems like a pretty daunting task, especially given all the factors we've been discussing.
Oh, it is daunting. But it starts with simple things. Challenging the language we use, confronting our own biases, being willing to have those uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
It also means being critical of the information we're consuming, questioning who's controlling the narrative.
It makes you wonder how much of our behavior today is still influenced by these historical patterns of stigma and silence. What are those unspoken rules, those taboos, that are still shaping our choices, even now?
That's a question we each need to ponder.
Yeah.
But there's another layer to this communication puzzle we need to explore. We've talked about barebacking as rebellion as a response to societal pressures.
Right.
But what if it's also a way of communicating something deeper? Something about our relationship with death and risk.
That's pretty intense. But I'm intrigued. Let's dive in. Okay, so diving into death and risk as forms of communication.
Right.
I gotta admit, that sounds a bit, well, abstract to me.
It might seem that way, yeah, but think about it. Our actions, they often speak volumes, especially when we're, facing danger.
Okay.
Engaging in something risky, like barebacking during the AIDS crisis. That sends a message, even if it's not, a deliberate one.
So what kind of message could it be sending?
Well, in some cases, it could be an expression of despair. If you're living with a devastating disease, facing so much stigma, it's understandable to feel a sense of hopelessness.
Right, I can see that. If your world already feels out of control, maybe the risk of HIV doesn't seem as significant.
Exactly. Or it could be a way to reclaim some agency in a world that's taken so much from you. Remember Donna Orange's point about society often glorifying risk takers while looking down on those who play it safe? In a world where you're already marginalized, taking risks, it might feel like a way to grab back some of that control,
It's like saying, I'm not going to let fear run my life. I'm going to live on my own terms, even if it means putting myself at risk.
Yeah, that's a powerful way to put it. And for some, it could even be a way of seeking connection and intimacy.
Oh, interesting.
In a world that's often rejected them.
That's kind of paradoxical, isn't it?
Right.
Risking your health to find connection.
It might seem that way on the surface, yeah, but risky behavior can be a way of testing those boundaries, Seeing who'll stick around, even when you're not exactly making the safest choices.
Right.
It's like saying, will you still accept me, knowing that I'm, putting myself in danger?
It's a dangerous way to look for validation, but I can see the appeal, especially when you're dealing with loneliness and isolation.
And this is where the communication aspect kind of comes full circle.
How so?
When someone engages in risky behavior, it forces a reaction from those around them. It starts a conversation, whether it's intentional or not.
It's like a desperate cry for attention, even if it's expressed in a self-destructive way.
Yeah, Exactly. And that's why it's so crucial to understand these underlying motivations, you know. We can't just address risky behavior at a surface level. We got to dig deeper, try to understand the emotional and social needs that are driving it.
So looking back at the AIDS epidemic, we're seeing this really complex web of factors.
Right.
The historical context of stigma and discrimination that urge to rebel against societal pressures, the influence of social groups, and it's this really profound need for connection, even if it's, expressed in ways that aren't healthy.
Yeah, and all of these factors, they're intertwined with the ways that people communicate, both within their communities and with the larger society.
It's a reminder that behavior is rarely simple. There are often these deeper reasons behind it, especially when it comes to something as emotionally charged as sex.
Absolutely. And that's why approaching these issues with empathy and a genuine desire to understand the why behind the behavior, that's so important.
Yeah, instead of judging or making assumptions, we need to be, more curious. Try to see the world from other people's perspectives.
Exactly right. And remember, this isn't just about the past. These insights about communication, about risk, about that human need for connection, they're just as relevant today.
Absolutely. As we wrap up this deep dive, this exploration of a really complex and often challenging topic, hope you're walking away with a few key things.
Okay.
Number one, behavior. It's rarely as straightforward as it appears. There are layers there, layers of meaning, motivations that need to be understood.
Right.
Number two, communication. It's incredibly powerful. It shapes our choices, both the good ones and the bad ones. And finally, empathy and understanding. Those are absolutely essential if we want to address risky behavior and, create a world where everyone feels safe, supported, and truly seen.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We can all benefit from being a little more curious, a little more compassionate, a little more willing to challenge those assumptions we hold about others. That's a great place to leave it.
I think so too. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.